Thank you. No sound.
Day by day, with each passing moment, strength I find to meet my trials here. Trusting it, others fighting so much. I've no cause for worry or fear. His heart is not beyond the measure. Gives unto each day what he deserves. Loving me is my pleasure. Every day the Lord himself is near me with a special mercy for each heart. All cares he fain repair and cheer me. He whose name is Counselor and Power. The protection of God and treasure is a charge that himself he laid. As your days, your strength shall be in measure. With a pledge he made. Happy and in every tribulation. So to the promise of hope that I lose tribulation. Offer me within thy holy word. Help me, Lord, when I trouble me. As you take care from others, is the moment till I reach the promised land.
Hi. Morning. Okay. The scripture for today is found in Hebrews 11 through 16, if you guys want to read it along with me. It says, "Each one of these people died, not yet having in hand what was promised, but still believing." How did they do it? They saw it way off in the distance, they're agreeing and accept that they were transients in this world. People who live this way make it plain that they are looking for their true home. If they were homesick for the old country, they could have gone back anytime they wanted. But they were after a far better country than that, heaven country. You can see why God is so proud of them and has his city waiting for them.
Please bow your heads with me for prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful Sabbath. We will come together to praise you. Thank you for the family members that had safety here this weekend, and that we can just all be joyous together and relax a busy school week. And I thank you for the blue skies and the birds we had this morning. And I just pray that you'll be with the parents that could not make it this weekend, but are really watching online. Praise your name. I pray. Amen.
Good morning and happy Sabbath. My name's Kevin. I was here last night with the film for Vespers. And this afternoon we're showing another film about for those aren't familiar with that name, he was a pastor and a resistor who got involved with the plot to assassinate Hitler during World War II. So definitely a very interesting character in history, someone who's been studied over the years by scholars. And I guess sort of naive view of history and ask what you want about your expert. That was completely shattered in getting involved with this project, largely because of our producer, Gary Blount, who's going to be sharing this for Sabbath. Gary called me up out of the blue who's in Minnesota, lives in Minnesota. There is a psychiatrist, and he asked me to get involved with this project. And he's introduced me to a lot of incredible people. We've traveled to Great Britain, we've traveled to Germany, met with numerous and in the process of to discover that Gary's really been the life feature for several decades, and he has read many books, more than I could even could. He has met with a lot of the surviving relatives of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, various friends, people who are very close to the story. So you're in for a real treat. Gary is just somebody who has really delved in and really wanted to know sort of what is the heart of the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I'm always going to interrupt here for
Sabbath morning. Nobody knows where you're going to accept. You know, but you don't know. I'm looking at these two films. Kevin, I got a little bit of credit here because Gary invited me to his area to speak about Rwanda. And then I showed him some of the film that we saw last night, and he got excited about that idea. So I'm just claiming a little credit here. No, this is the thing, not all silliness aside. In Rwanda, Sabbath, April 2, where people worship and singing and praying in church. And the following Sabbath, some of those same people had machetes in their hands. I'm not trying to be dramatic. That's just the reality of what happened in Rwanda over the course of 1 week. Sabbath keepers from singing praise, the beautiful songs we sang this morning, and the next Sabbath they had machetes in their hands. And I'm thinking there's got to be angels saying, "Come on, God, what are the people who call you, God? What are they doing?" And here is the story of Bonhoeffer. I wonder if the people of Rwanda would have seen this courageous man who's standing up against Hitler as a Christian, standing up against Hitler. If we would have known the story of Bonhoeffer, would the story in Rwanda have been any different? Would it have been more than Rwanda? Because there were enormous Christians and an enormous number of Adventists. So as we listen to Bonhoeffer's story here, we're in that bigger picture, not just of what happened in Rwanda, but what's happening today in America. Back to you, Kevin.
I grabbed a mic because I know Carl's going to try to steal mine. We're going to, the three of us, share this morning here in Sabbath school. I think we're trying to get you guys involved a bit. Gary, why don't you come up and get this started?
Thank you. Thank you for coming. A huge thank you to Shelley Bacon, who put this Bonhoeffer presentation together at this end. Working on this for weeks. I really appreciate the amount of work she's done and does so well. My wife sent her greetings. She had every intention of being here, but she came down cold before we got on the plane. I want to thank Carl and Teresa for hosting me, and Carl's father in his home for the weekend, and for helping me today. And I want to thank Kevin for hanging in with me the last 3 years to finish this film and our version of the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We hope in a way, again, we hope we'll get the attention of young people, church people, to be sure, but also non-church people. And you will see in film this afternoon, those of you who are able to come, that in the first few minutes you may wonder what you've gotten yourself into. It doesn't seem very much like a religious story, but in there, there's a big contrast between the way it starts and the people we feature in the start of the film, and then the story of Bonhoeffer. And there's one person who kind of acts as a bridge between the two parts, a fascinating person, and we'll talk more about him later today. I thought it might be a good idea to just do a pre-test. How many of you are students here? I see an awful lot of students. Thank you so much for coming. This was voluntary, I'm sure. Is this mandatory?
No, it's Sabbath school.
Well, it's going to be school because I'm going to give you a quiz, and I'm going to tell you that I didn't like the sounds of mandatory anything in high school and college, but probably it was only because at Elsier College in those days we had mandatory moral training on the chapel, and for 5 days, 1 hour each day, I listened to Dr. Edward Heppenstall, famous Adventist theologian, unfold the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So here's your, I'd like to raise your hand for true, false, wherever you care, come down. This has been test-driven this morning.
So we first raise our hands for true?
True, and then I will ask for the...
All right, all right.
Here's the first question, just the fascination through this material. Number one, Dietrich Bonhoeffer translated the Bible into German. How many say that is true? How many say that is false?
Didn't do it.
Didn't know that. All right. Number two, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a handwriting analyst. How many say that's true? You gotta get that answer there higher. You know, it's about 3 people. How many say it's false? He was not a handwriting analyst.
He was.
True. Number 3, Dietrich Bonhoeffer became a militant anti-communist. How many say that's true? 10, maybe? How many say false? Awful lot of undecided here. I think
There were communists back then?
there were certainly. Communists came in third. Those are right. Number 4, July 20, 1944. July 20, 1944, there was a big celebration of Hitler's birthday. True? False?
July 22 is my wife's birthday.
Where is Shelley? This is hard to be in the crowd. This microphone. I was rusted in the face of using first to get off the sidelines.
It's
July
Sabbath school.
20.
It's Sabbath school. Come on.
Oh, yeah, cool. Sabbath. And my faults. They were deep in Germany, but why? If people here know what was so important about July 20, 1944, we'll come back to that as well. Number 5, anybody go for Malt? I saw one. Okay. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor, theologian, and double agent. How many say that's true?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
How many say that one's false? True. Number 6, Adolf Hitler was a nominal Catholic. True. Who's false? He was a nominal Catholic, and he could speak the language. It changed as he went deeper into the Third Reich. Number 7, many Protestants in Germany refused to salute the flag, the swastika. That true? Many Protestants in Germany refused to salute the flag. Unfortunately, that was false.
Only one group.
One group, Anybody shout out the name of the group that rather consistently refused
Might have knocked on your door lately.
Jehovah's Witnesses? Right.
They're the only one group.
In Germany, baptized Christians. False. That was true. And some for relatives, like his two sisters' husband. Number 9, Dietrich Bonhoeffer drove an convertible. Whispered, and finally, Dietrich Bonhoeffer became a great Westminster Abbey. That's true. That's false. That is true. We'll go back to that one perhaps. Ask Riley if I get to that. Briefly, I think if you want to understand the modern poster child for Christian courage and faithfulness, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to know something about him starting in 1930. It was a black thing, it's a rough. Those who say, seem like 90% of the population, 4 million people voted, and Hitler came in second. There was some bullying and intimidation. The politician eventually came to the position. In a democracy, a modern democracy, in more or less constitutional ways, and was popular. Germany soon became a nation clearly on the move. New highways, autobahns, new restaurants, new businesses, new aircraft, especially fighters, bombers, new jobs. Unemployment virtually disappeared. And through the 1930s, Germany increasingly became a state held in a terror chokehold. Now, the theologian, pastor, as a teacher, Bonhoeffer emphasized certain things, emphasized independence and invitation. He emphasized both testaments of the Bible, which was a little bit unusual in Germany. He made sure the Old Testament to follow the New Testament, and he emphasized not only the fellowship, and one of his famous books about that subject was written when he was teaching students upon the text in 1930, called Life Together. Very inspirational book that's used in many small group Bible studies. There's no doubt that 2 major influences on him were the time he spent at Bethel, which was a refuge for the severely physically and mentally impaired in Germany, and the year he spent in the United States, mainly in Harlem. Both experiences gave this young man who had grown up in a large family, one of achievers, all of them, 7 servants, children, his father, all that stuff. And now, by the mid-1930s, he has the perspective of those who suffer, rejected, reviled, the helpless. Eventually, this sympathy was transformed into empathy, and Carl spoke of that last night, how important empathy is. By the 1930s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was well known in Europe and somewhat known in the U.S. as a voice for the underdog, including Jews, and also a voice for the church as an instrument of peace. Those who write books and articles and emphasize the point that Bonhoeffer was an assassin are missing an important point. He was a peacemaker. I hope you'll agree after you see our film. Trouble was, the church, overall church composite, didn't see it exactly that way. Most denominations fell into line with the Nazis and muscular Christianity. And the Nazis demanded total control, and most of the churches traded staying in existence for Nazi control of the churches. And there weren't many exceptions. And leading that movement, submitting to the will of the Nazi Party and the government, was the Lutheran Church. And there are many photographs, you can see them online, of churches that have replaced the Bible on the altar with a swastika. Some scholars, as they have reviewed what was going on in the churches, say that there was a perceptible transformation into a different type of church. It was forsaking the traditions of the Christian church and embracing what is called modern paganism. I've been fascinated by the world of spies and secret agents. My parents were aware of this fascination, but were not inclined to accept that it was innate, as I claimed, or to accept it as an excuse when I was apprehended in the 8th grade. I was caught after a series of break-ins, steaming open envelopes containing both incoming and outgoing romantic messages between my beautiful teenage sister and her not-so-beautiful forbidden boyfriend. My defense was that the contents of these purloined letters enjoyed a very limited distribution and readership, and that defense was ruled irrelevant. My parents exacted a punishment, what we now call consequence, I believe, commensurate with the offense. Several years later, I found myself head down in what passes as thought, walking down the main street of Kingstown, St. Vincent, a gorgeous speck of land in the Eastern Caribbean. I was minding my own business, and my business was history master at a private high school in town. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. Suddenly, an ominous shadow moving from the opposite direction broke my stride, and I looked up to see the most recognizable politician on this island of 100,000. It was the out-of-favor former premier of the government, a charismatic leader with some anti-American instincts. Some of my West Indian friends called him a clever but dangerous rascal. At 3 paces, we stood facing each other on that not especially busy or noisy sidewalk. He said but one word, a pronouncement that made me shiver slightly in the tropical sun: CIA. He then spat on the sidewalk between us and walked on by. My third sojourn into the land of spooks, the place of suspicions, lies, deceptions, all sorts of more or less justifiable acts like opening my sister's mail, occurred just a few years ago. A young lady, single white female, age 25, MA, Ivy League, fluent in 2 languages, including English, 2 nationality parents, church-going Christian. Her problem? Insomnia. I thought to myself, this will be easy. I knew this young lady would be showing up in my office, and I knew that she knew I knew that she was a CIA officer on active duty. After checking the hall to ensure nobody was listening, I introduced myself. Let me get right to the point. I know you can't sleep. Are you exercising still 2 hours in the evening? How about that full throttle just before bedtime? Have you tried My Pillow? You've seen it on TV. After about 10 minutes of this nonsense, it became obvious that the patient and doctor were equally nervous. She finally broke the rhythm of the interview by sobbing. I keep seeing 2 of my fellow officers blown up by a suicide bomber last month. Nightmares, daymares, whatever you call them. About the time Kevin and our German colleague, Helmut Schlingenziepen, and I were putting the finishing touches on this little Bonhoeffer project, Sir Max Hastings, an eminent British historian, came out with a new book, The Secret War. Eagerly, I opened it. I sure hope I haven't missed anything. Here's a chapter by Malcolm Muggeridge, former MI6 officer, former editor of Punch magazine, late in life convert to Christianity, celebrated 20th century Christian apologist. Malcolm Muggeridge, known as an eloquent and tireless promoter of Mother Teresa, different one, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Let's see what he has to say. And I quote, "Spycraft attracts so many weird people, it necessarily involves such cheating, lying, betraying, that it has a deleterious effect on the character. I never met anyone professionally engaged in whom I should trust in any capacity." Well, I knew he didn't like his contemporary Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond, but really? I read on. Writers of thrillers, thank you, tend to gravitate to the Secret Service as sure as the mentally ill become psychiatrists. And that's exactly what Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer did in the late 1930s. He gravitated toward the German Secret Service. At least one of the German secret services, the Abwehr, military secret service. Can you imagine how confusing this was to many people? Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave up the security of New York City, his good name for having a bad name with the rowdy Nazis, book deals, and the company of a close and loving family, and the prospect of marriage to a brilliant, young, aristocratic girl. Dietrich Bonhoeffer appeals to me because his faith takes him right to the edge of rationality. He appeals to me because he calls a spade and is centered on a specific response to God's commands. And I thank God that we know so much about his extraordinary humanness. We know so much, not only from his numerous saved letters, but from accounts of his friends, from his companions. I'd like to know how you could not love a lonesome, young German pastor in England before the war who acquires a St. Bernard puppy for companionship, and then one day looks in horror as this fluffy, trained puppy is run over right in front of his rented house, and see how he grieves that loss. We learned from his friends he was nearly inconsolable. See him in 1943, middle of the war, a prisoner, Tegel Prison, Berlin, ministering to his fellow inmates, teaching them hymns, praying with them, but also sharing the little money he had, and on occasion figuring out a way to refer a family member of a fellow inmate to his father, the famous neurologist and psychiatrist Karl Bonhoeffer. The point was to help in any way possible. Perhaps his father could find a way to certify somebody else unfit for service in the German army. And just when I think I understand the theology of the decisive and passionate Dietrich Bonhoeffer and can predict his position on a wide range of issues, I recall the title of one of his sermons, "We Don't Know What to Do." He didn't have to take a position on everything. Let's come alongside a gray car slowly making its way up the hill to Flossenburg, KC, concentration camp. It's the evening of April 8, 1945, and everybody knows the war in Europe is as good as over. Hitler's promise of secret weapons which would turn the tide just in time had come to naught. How close had Hitler come? A year earlier, German pilots had flown the Messerschmitt 163 into battle. Literally a rocket plane reaching speeds of 700 miles an hour, climbing to 39,000 feet in 180 seconds. This was followed by the Me-262, first jet fighter aircraft. Yet, Germany was doomed. Passing through the gates of Flossenburg, prisoner Bonhoeffer reads the ambiguous welcome welded into the gate. Arbeit macht frei. Work will make you free. Did he think to compare that to the perverse greeting at the camp he had just left, Buchenwald? Jedem das Seine. Everyone gets what he deserves. Did Bonhoeffer think to recall his circular letter to his students scattered all over the place following the Gestapo closing of the confessing church seminaries? These were the alternative seminaries for the training of pastors who did not line up with Nazis. The letter, April 15, 1941. I commend all of you to the one who can protect you day and night, who will lead you and us into his kingdom. Some Bonhoeffer scholars say that by the end of the war and Bonhoeffer's mighty struggle to survive, he had substantially modified his theology. By the time he arrived at Flossenburg concentration camp, he had long since shifted his gaze from God the omnipotent to God the fellow sufferer.
Thank you, Gary. I think we're going to roll through some slides here. If we could get the first slide up on the screen. This is, in some ways, where our story starts in 2 Timothy 4:21, verse that's just a brief message to Timothy from Paul, and he's asking among a number of things to bring his coat, and as winter's coming, he's urging him to make it quick, to make a decision to come. Because otherwise, there's a chance, given the climate and the season, there's a chance that he might not get through if he waits any longer. And so Gary chose to title our film "Come Before Winter" for a number of reasons.
Bonhoeffer is sitting in his dormitory. Can you put yourself in his place? New York City, dormitory that's still there. You can see it. He's sitting there. I think I would have been out on the town. The Yankees were playing not too far away. Lou Gehrig was playing his last season. World's Fair was on. Television had just been introduced at the World's Fair. It was quite an exciting time in New York City, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer had just arrived from Germany, safe. His friends had gotten him out just in time. The war would start within the next 2 months. He's sitting there and he writes in his diary, I just turned to 2 Timothy 4:21 and read this. And what did he think of? Whom did he think of? He thought of his students, he thought of his family, and he felt guilty that he was in the safety of New York, almost miraculously, some people could say, how the money was found to bring him across the Atlantic on a passenger liner at that point. And he said, I've got to go back, and I've got to tell the people who brought me here that I'm going back. And they were not happy at all. And some of them tried and tried for days to talk him out of it.
And if anyone had an excuse, it would have been him. He was there for, you could say, good reasons. He was working for a church, at least one church.
Refugees?
He was working with refugees. But I think what he says in the phrase that stands out in my mind from his journal entry is that this verse has been haunting me all day. And he just cannot shake this urgent plea that Paul is sending to Timothy, and feeling a parallel to the people in Germany, the church in Germany, and the place and the role that he could have and has had in their efforts.
And how old is he about now?
He is
32?
he is about 34.
34.
So he's your age, Kevin. Sorry, I didn't mean to tell your age. But he's a young guy, he's not married,
That's right.
and this verse is haunting him. Wow.
And he has a stipend to stay in New York for 1 year. And that's the only way anybody could think of to get him out of the army. He was a conscientious objector. He had tried to become a chaplain in the German army, but was rejected. And to get out of the country was the only option. So we'll go to the next slide, and this is probably the verse that grabbed me 50-some years ago as a student at La Sierra College. This is from the book originally entitled Discipleship. I carried that little paperback edition around with me for quite a while. The title was changed to, it was changed from The Cost of Discipleship to Discipleship several years ago. Cheap grace is the preaching of grace without requiring repentance. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. That's in the front, on the front page of that little paperback book. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. How would you like to come out of Week of Prayer and say to your girlfriend, you know, we got to talk about this book that was presented in Week of Prayer. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come. That's not a very light topic, especially with the Vietnam War closing in on many of us. And we sort of understood at that point how the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer came out. This seems pretty much a downer. So we're going to go quickly through a few chapters in his life.
I guess something that stands out to me about Bonhoeffer, though, is even though he has this sort of self-sacrificial message, he enjoys life to the full. He was an excellent pianist. I love reading the stories of him, and he had a good friend, and they would play duets deep into the night when he lived in England for a while. And loved music, loved cars, right? Or
he did. And here he is with, I think, there may be a real car person here. Carl was talking about somebody. But I think this could be called an Audi. And I think the Audi was the successor to the German DKW. Anyway, it was a racy little car that his parents bought him when he was director of the illegal seminary that I've referred to for the Confessing Church. And he would take his friends all over the place, and he would give them money, such as he had. He didn't have a lot of spending money, but there he is with his best friend standing at his convertible, and his best friend married his niece and became his biographer at the end of the war. He was also arrested. That's Eberhard Bethke. The next slide And there aren't really very many more of these. I thinned them out considerably. And the next slide shows his brother Klaus, a stately-looking fellow. He was the chief legal advisor to Lufthansa Airlines. Did he pull Dietrich into the resistance, or did Dietrich pull him into the resistance? I'm not sure. But they were both up to their eyeballs in the German resistance for years. And there's his wife, Klaus Bonhoeffer's wife, the most outspoken member of the Bonhoeffer clan. And here is her famous quote for the ages: "Christians are strange. They're happy if someone else shoots Hitler." There's a lot of truth to that, isn't there?
And I think that's something interesting about Bonhoeffer is that he definitely didn't live in a Christian bubble. Even a number of members of his family, kind of agnostic, definitely not as strong in the faith. Some members of his family were. But he was in close association with some of the best thinkers in Germany. And they talked about a lot of these things. They debated a lot of these things, and I think Bonhoeffer is sometimes represented or sometimes portrayed as sort of a lone wolf. But it was the people in his life that had a big impact on what he said and what he did.
Bonhoeffer was a great letter writer before he went to prison, during prison. If you want his prison letters, they're in a book entitled Letters and Papers from Prison, collected by his best friend Eberhard Bethge. Many of his letters were destroyed. They were too incriminating of other people, especially in the resistance. But this is the famous Christmas letter, and we have several quotes from this letter. This was a turning point, perhaps, in his life. He says this maybe 3 months before he's arrested by the Gestapo. He says, "I'm throwing my lot in with the people at the bottom, people who suffer. Remains an experience of incomparable value if for once learn to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, the reviled, in short, from the perspective of those who suffer." One group he probably is referring very secretly to here is the White Rose, a group of students. Students, I said, 17, 18, 19, at the University of Munich. You could go to university younger than in the States. Generally, that's true in Europe. And the White Rose was made up of graffiti artists, pamphleteers. They were some of the first in 1942 to distribute anti-Hitler slogans in various cities in Germany. He knew about them, and he may have had them in mind when he's writing this Christmas letter, as well as many other people in mind. The next picture is of his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law comes from a very famous musical family. Are you awake back there? His father, this person's father, was a famous Hungarian composer, conductor, ended up in the United States. His son, this person's son, became the conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra for about 20 years. Still alive. This is a self-portrait by Hans Fontanani, who probably should be considered the intellectual head of the German resistance, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law. Next slide is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's fiancée. Well, you say, how old is she? They got engaged just before he went into prison in 1943. I think she was 19 at that time. Much, much younger. That wasn't terribly uncommon. She had been Bonhoeffer's catechism student. There's a very interesting history, I think, of that whole relationship, how it developed. And she came to the States eventually after the war and became the highest ranking engineer in Honeywell Corporation. Here is a note he writes to her in 1953, a few months after he's put in the prison. Christ visits the prisons. This is one of my favorite lines. I know He will not pass me by. For a pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer had interesting connections. He sure did. He knew all kinds of people. He didn't spend most of his time with the church board. He spent a lot of time with youth groups and all, but he didn't preach all over the place. He knew a lot of people in different lines of work, and I think this quote by his best friend is referring mainly to all his connections in the underground, in the German underground. And then here's a Jewish historian who had become a Christian who says, in another place, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of all these Christian resistors, is my favorite because he was the most steadfast. And he says of this whole group of Christian resistors, they were all as much strangers in their own country as they were rebuffed abroad.
Kind of reminds me of the verse that the students read up this morning of looking for another country, not accepting, not trying to just simply integrate themselves and be comfortable where they're at, but looking ahead to something better.
And here is one concrete act he took, and this is the most concrete act I'm familiar with that had to concrete treason at the highest level. He gets on this plane from Berlin. This is not too long, 6 months before he's arrested, and he takes a list of all the principal conspirators, flies to Sweden, neutral Sweden, and gives it to the man who might have become the next Archbishop of Canterbury, a British churchman. He gives them a list of all these resistors. Why did he do that? This was to raise the credibility of the resistance. Look, these are generals, these are mayors, we're not just a bunch of people sitting around kicking this around in school or whatever. These guys are willing to put their lives on the line and have been doing it. So he flies up there and gives the list. And the answer from Churchill is, when he sees the note, on no account have the slightest negotiations, direct or indirect, with the Hun. That's German, of course. Next is the chaplain of the prison where Bonhoeffer was incarcerated for the first year and a half. He was a devout Christian, friend of Bonhoeffer's. They worked together. He called Bonhoeffer his assistant chaplain in the prison. And then the next slide is of two of the most interesting, to me anyway, people in this whole story, two brothers. You'll see one of these brothers in Tom Cruise's movie Valkyrie. Both of these brothers played an extremely important role in specific, serious, definitive assassination attempts. Both friends of Bonhoeffer. Tell us about the first one, Werner von Heften. He met Bonhoeffer one evening.
So the gentleman on the left, the younger, I think, right? Younger brother?
Yes.
He met Bonhoeffer at a dinner party, pulled him aside, and he said, I have the ability to get pretty close to Hitler. I have a gun. Shall I shoot him? He asked him straight out. This was 1942, I think?
Yes.
And I think this is something that's characteristic of Bonhoeffer. They end up talking for about 2 hours. And we don't know exactly everything that was said, but there was something along the lines of, morally, yes, I think that you can, but you need to count the cost. You need to ask yourself, who are the other people who are going to be killed because of this? What are the implications, the collateral damage? And I think that's something really interesting about Bonhoeffer, and I'm going to try to but I may make a few people squirm for a few moments. But we've had an interesting challenge getting this story out. It's one thing to kind of make it in our small group, but then when you let it out into the world, people perceive it differently. And a number of people at our screenings have said, wow, so many people a lot more people have showed up than usually show up for these kind of events. And we would say, oh, well, what do you think? Why is that? And well, it's because of the political tensions that we're feeling in our country right now. And there's been people who have mistaken our screenings as sort of some sort of anti-Trump campaign. And there's been people on our Facebook page who have said things like, so glad that you're making something about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a man who stood up to socialism. And there's been sometimes something tense, but there's something I think that all sides of the spectrum like about Bonhoeffer, and that is that he's clear, he's decisive, and he speaks up. But I think this story of these two brothers brings in another part of Bonhoeffer that I think challenges me, because I think there's more to this than just simply speaking up strongly, and that is the ability to think deeply, to think prayerfully, and to really find out what the best argument is from all sides. And I think that's something that Bonhoeffer he gets from his family. I think his associates, and I think that's something that he contributes to the assassination attempt.
I remember that signal from Sabbath school. It's 15 more minutes, is that right? 2? Okay, I like the other brother even better. That's the other von Heften. I like both of them a lot. But the older brother was hauled before the hanging Judge Freisler. And you come this afternoon, you will see actual film footage of this judge screaming at these hapless prisoners who are dragged in front of him. He asks this one, he said, "You're a Christian. You took an oath of allegiance to Hitler. What do you have to say for yourself? You know, you and I have only one thing in common as a Christian and Nazi. Both demand the whole person." Von Heften says, "Yeah, I did take an oath, but Hitler is the perpetrator of evil in history. Number one, largest scale possible. That's all I have to say." The next slide is Roland Freisler, who's the judge, who's screaming at these poor prisoners. The next slide is Bonhoeffer's 4-month or so home in the basement of the Gestapo prison in Berlin. The left-hand picture is more representative, I'd say, where he was bombed every day. And the final slide in that series is a quote. "On the threshold of eternity, he heard a new song. In the hell that was the Gestapo interrogation prison, Bonhoeffer was graced with a visitation of angels. The great invisible realm had become now visible, and there remained no longer any doubt about its real existence." Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are going to transition now to our church and the Hymn Fest. So if you are seated in these chairs here, if you could help us, as you could just stand up and turn your chairs towards the piano in the center. We're going to take about a 5-10 minute intermission, and then we're going to get ready for our church service, our Hymn Fest. Also, just a reminder as well, lunch is provided immediately after church for all families in the cafeteria, and hope to see you down there. Thank you.